Welcome to Warriors of the World, where today we step back into 15th century France, a nation torn apart by conflict, despair, and a flickering hope kept alive by faith. Close your eyes and imagine a land devastated by war, fields scorched, villages abandoned, and the sound of marching armies echoing across the hills. In the midst of this chaos, one figure emerged to challenge destiny, a young peasant girl named Joan, who would forever change the fate of her homeland. France, at the time, was gripped by the 100 Years' War, an exhausting conflict with England that had dragged on for decades. Vast regions of the kingdom were under English control, aided by their Burgundian allies. Meanwhile, Charles VII, the French dauphin and rightful heir to the throne, was a king in name only, struggling to rally support. The countryside was ravaged, and the common people bore the brunt of the suffering: starvation, violence, and a seemingly endless war. Joan was born into this turmoil in 1412, in the small village of Domremy, near the border of contested territories. The daughter of devout peasants, her life seemed destined to remain tied to the rhythms of rural France. But at just 13 years old, Joan claimed she began hearing voices, messages, she said, from Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. They brought her a divine mission. She was to lead France to victory and ensure Charles VI's coronation in Reims. For a young girl in a world ruled by kings and armies, such a calling seemed impossible. Yet Joan embraced it with unwavering faith. While others might have doubted or hesitated, Joan was certain that her destiny was real. Was it madness, a miracle, or something else entirely? Whatever the truth, Joan was ready to act. At just 16, Joan left behind her village and began a journey that would bring her face to face with the trials of destiny. Dressed in men's clothing to avoid detection and protect herself, she traveled to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs. There, she sought out the local commander, hoping to convince him to bring her to the Dauphin, Charles VII. Her claims of divine visions were met with ridicule and disbelief by the soldiers and nobles alike. Yet Joan's determination was unshakable, and eventually she won their trust. Joan finally reached Charles VI's court at Chinon, where she would have a fateful meeting with the Dauphin himself. According to legend, Charles, wary of impostors, disguised himself among his courtiers to test Joan's supposed divine insight. Remarkably, Joan picked him out immediately and delivered her message. The voices had told her he was the rightful king of France and that he must be crowned at Reims. Her confidence and sincerity left an undeniable impression on Charles and his advisors, though skeptics continued to question her motives. Desperate for a turning point in a war that seemed unwinnable, Charles decided to take a chance. Joan was outfitted with armor, a horse, and a white banner bearing the words Jesus and Mary. With this, she was sent to the front lines to accomplish what seasoned generals had failed to do: break the Siege of Orléans. Picture the scene: a teenage girl, untrained in war, riding at the head of an army that had lost hope long ago. But Joan was no ordinary leader. With every step her army took, she carried a faith so powerful that it rekindled the courage of soldiers and peasants alike. The impossible suddenly seemed within reach. The city of Orléans had been under siege by the English for months, a critical stronghold for both sides. For the French, it was a symbol of resistance, but morale was at an all-time low. When Joan arrived in April 1429, she didn't just bring reinforcements, she brought hope. Riding into the city with her banner held high, she became a beacon of faith for both soldiers and citizens. From the moment she entered the battlefield, Joan made it clear she wasn't there to watch from the sidelines. Despite resistance from veteran commanders, she insisted on leading from the front. Her methods were unconventional, but her presence electrified the troops. As the battles raged on, French soldiers who had once been demoralized began to rally around her. Eyewitnesses described Joan holding her white banner, leading charges that shattered English defenses. The turning point came on May 7, 1429, when Joan led an assault on a key English fortification. During the fighting, she was struck by an arrow. Instead of retreating, she pulled herself back up, her determination reigniting the fighting spirit of her men. By May 8, the English forces retreated, and Orléans was free, the first major French victory in years. This victory was a game-changer in the 100 Years' War. Joan had proven herself not only as a leader but as a symbol of national unity. The tide of the war was shifting, and France, once resigned to defeat, now believed in the possibility of victory. But as Joan's fame grew, so did the efforts of her enemies to bring her down. To the English, she was no longer just an opponent. she was a threat to be eliminated. After the triumph at Orléans, Joan turned her focus to her ultimate goal, ensuring Charles VII's coronation at Reims. But the road to Reims would be fraught with challenges. The English and their allies controlled much of the territory between Charles's forces and the sacred city. Additionally, within Charles's court, skepticism about Joan's influence persisted. Yet her success at Orléans had earned the Dauphin's trust, and Joan was entrusted to lead a campaign to open the path to Reims. Between June and July 1429, Joan spearheaded a series of decisive victories. Many towns surrendered without resistance, their defenders shaken by the legend of the Maid of Orléans. The campaign was swift and effective, showcasing Joan not only as an inspirational figure but also as a competent strategist. On July 17, 1429, Charles VII was crowned in the Grand Cathedral of Reims, with Joan standing by his side, holding her banner high. For Joan, this moment was the fulfillment of her divine mission, a culmination of the Voice's promise. The cathedral, filled with hymns and the sound of ringing bells, symbolized a renewed France. Yet, the coronation was not the end of Joan's journey. To her, the liberation of France was far from complete. But within the royal court, her growing influence began to stir unease. Some feared that the peasant girl who had risen to prominence might overshadow the king himself. While Joan prepared for further campaigns, the seeds of political betrayal were quietly being sown around her. After the coronation of Charles VII in Reims, Joan believed her divine mission was far from over. Although the king's legitimacy had been secured, vast territories of France remained under English and Burgundian control. For Joan, the fight wasn't just a political or military struggle, it was a sacred duty to free her homeland. Yet, while she focused on the war ahead, Charles and his court seemed more concerned with consolidating their power and avoiding unnecessary risks. Joan turned her attention to Paris, then controlled by the Burgundians. She pushed for an assault on the city, but the king's lukewarm support hindered her efforts. In September 1429, Joan led an attack on Paris's formidable defenses. As always, she fought at the front lines, even sustaining a wound to her thigh from an arrow. Despite her courage, the assault failed, and Charles ordered a retreat. This defeat marked the beginning of a rift between Joan and the royal court. Undeterred, Joan continued to fight, leading smaller campaigns throughout the winter of 1429 and into the spring of 1430. However, her influence at court was waning. Advisors who envied her growing fame began to sideline her, while military commanders questioned the practicality of her divine-driven strategies. The fervor that once surrounded her was fading, but Joan's faith and determination remained as strong as ever. By May 1430, Joan made her way to Compiègne, a strategic town under threat from Burgundian forces. She took command of a small force and prepared to defend the town. Little did she know that her time as a warrior was coming to an end. On May 23, 1430, Joan led an attack to break the Burgundian siege of Compiègne. The initial assault was fierce, but the French forces were soon overwhelmed. In the chaos, Joan was trapped outside the city walls. As she fought to hold her ground, she was pulled from her horse and captured by Burgundian soldiers. Her capture was a devastating blow to France. The symbol of French resistance was now in enemy hands. The Burgundians, seeing her as a valuable prize, sold her to the English for a substantial sum. To the English, Joan wasn't just a military opponent, she was a spiritual and political threat that needed to be eliminated. As Joan was moved from one castle to another, the hope of her rescue began to fade. Charles VII, who owed so much to her victories, made little effort to secure her release. In the French court, her capture was met with indifference, and some even saw it as convenient. Joan's growing influence had become a source of tension among the nobles, and her absence made her less of a problem for them. Eventually, Joan was taken to Rouen, an English stronghold, where she would face a trial orchestrated by her enemies. The Maid of Orléans, who had defied armies and inspired a nation, now found herself abandoned, preparing to face the full force of political and religious persecution. Joan's arrival in Rouen in 1431 marked the beginning of one of history's most notorious trials. Orchestrated by the English and presided over by church officials, the trial was a calculated effort to destroy her reputation. Joan wasn't just a military opponent. To her captors, she was a threat to the established order. By branding her a heretic, they aimed to undermine not only her mission but also Charles VII, whose legitimacy as king was deeply tied to her victories. The trial was overseen by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a staunch ally of the English. From the outset, it was clear the proceedings were heavily biased. Joan was denied legal counsel and subjected to relentless interrogations designed to confuse and incriminate her. Despite her lack of formal education, Joan's responses were remarkably sharp and composed, leaving even her accusers astonished. Much of the questioning focused on her visions. Were they divine messages or deceptions from the devil? They also fixated on her choice to wear men's clothing, an act considered scandalous for a woman of her time. Joan defended herself with conviction, explaining that her clothing was a practical measure for safety and a part of her divine mission. Despite her courage, the trial was a foregone conclusion. The English demanded a guilty verdict, and Cauchon was determined to deliver. On May 24, 1431, under threat of immediate execution, Joan signed a document of abjuration, temporarily renouncing her visions to save her life. However, she soon recanted, declaring that her confession had been coerced and reaffirming her belief in the voices that had guided her. On May 30, 1431, Joan was sentenced to death for heresy. To her captors, her execution was not just a punishment, it was an attempt to erase her legacy and discredit everything she had fought for. She was led to the marketplace in Rouen, where a crowd had gathered to witness her fate. Picture the scene: a 19-year-old girl, chained and surrounded by soldiers, facing the flames with a composure that moved even some of her enemies. Joan requested a cross, holding it close to her heart as the fire consumed her. Witnesses reported that her final words were, "Jesus, Jesus," a testament to her unwavering faith. Her death, however, did not have the intended effect. Instead of discrediting her, it turned Joan into a martyr. Even among her detractors, doubts about the fairness of her trial began to emerge. In France, her sacrifice galvanized the national cause, and Charles VII, who had remained silent during her trial, would eventually lead France to victory over the English. Years later, in 1456, the Church conducted a posthumous retrial at Charles's request. Joan was declared innocent, and the charges of heresy were annulled. But by then, her legacy had already transcended the trial. She had become a symbol of courage, faith, and the unyielding spirit of a nation. 25 years after Joan's execution, the Church reopened her case under pressure from Charles VII. In 1456, an ecclesiastical court officially nullified the charges of heresy, declaring the original trial politically motivated and unjust. This act not only restored Joan's reputation but also affirmed her crucial role in saving France. Yet Joan's legacy had already grown far beyond the courtroom. To the French people, she was a symbol of faith and patriotism, a heroine who had given everything for her country. Her courage on the battlefield and her unwavering devotion to her beliefs inspired countless generations. She was remembered not just as a warrior but as a martyr whose life embodied the fight for justice and freedom. Over the centuries, Joan's story continued to resonate as France emerged as a unified nation. Her life became a powerful narrative of resilience and determination, celebrated in art, literature, and national memory. In 1920, Pope Benedict XV canonized her as Saint Joan of Arc, officially recognizing her as a saint. This act solidified her spiritual legacy and ensured her place as one of history's most enduring figures. Today, Joan's presence is felt throughout France, in statues, churches, and annual commemorations. Her name is synonymous with courage and sacrifice. Her story belongs not just to France, but to the world, as a testament to the power of belief and perseverance. Joan's influence extends far beyond history books. Her life has inspired countless works of art, literature, film, and music. Movies like The Passion of Joan of Arc, 1928, by Carl Theodor Dreyer capture the emotional intensity of her trial, while Joan of Arc, 1999, starring Milla Jovovich, offers a modern retelling of her story. Writers like Mark Twain celebrated her in personal recollections of Joan of Arc, highlighting both her humanity and heroism. In video games, Joan appears in titles like Age of Empires II and Civilization, embodying the ideals of leadership and inspiration. Her story has also been brought to life in theater and opera, proving that her legacy remains as vibrant as ever. Joan's life serves as a reminder of how one individual can defy all odds and leave an indelible mark on history. Her story, however, raises profound questions. Was her success truly miraculous, or the result of exceptional determination and leadership? Was she a visionary military strategist or a tool of political manipulation? These contradictions make her even more compelling, an enigmatic figure who continues to captivate historians and artists alike. As we reflect on Joan's life, we're left to wonder, what would we do if faced with such an extraordinary calling? Joan reminds us that courage and faith can move mountains, but also that heroism often comes at a great cost. Thank you for joining us on Warriors of the World. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe, share, and hit the notification bell to stay with us for more adventures. See you in the next battle.